Good morning and welcome to Sunday Politics Scotland. Coming up on the programme, keeping the pound and reducing the deficit, just part of the Growth Commission's plan to see an independent Scotland's economy rival countries like Denmark and Finland. Sensible perhaps, but will it set the heather alight? I'll be speaking to the report's author, Andrew Wilson. And the Palestinian runners hoping to highlight restrictions on movement back home by running in today's Edinburgh Marathon.
When we want to run a full marathon in Palestine, you have to run the same road 4 times in order to finish the full distance of a marathon. So that's the idea behind the Right to Movement.
Hello and welcome to the programme. It was 20 months in the making, runs to 354 pages and contains 50 key recommendations. So we're probably not going to have time to go through all of it today, but with me to give it a good try is the author himself, Andrew Wilson. Well, let's just start with a very big issue, Europe. Your document does not assume Scotland will be a full member of the European Union. It says it might be a good idea to be in the single market, but then Britain might end up in the single market. It just seems rather extraordinary that the SNP's Growth Commission doesn't assume full membership of the European Union, given that that's the entire basis for arguing for another referendum.
Well, it's not in our brief to determine what's going to happen with Britain's very disorderly exit from the European Union and the starting point where we find ourselves. So knowing that no one knows what's going on, we decided to take a look at what we would require to do no matter the outcome we found ourselves in. All we've said is it's in all of our interest to maximise frictionless free trade and the movement of people, goods and services between us and the rest of the UK, Ireland and Europe.
But do you think an independent Scotland should be a full member of the European Union?
I think absolutely and emphatically so, yes.
Right. OK. Do you think there should be another independence referendum?
I think we will require to choose what's in our best interests at a time when we're ready, really. I'm really not in a position to be able to say.
Well, I know. I'm just interested in your opinion.
All of the conclusions of the report are that if we want to succeed as a country, to get the same living standards and social cohesion of the countries that we've identified, we need to be the same as the most successful countries in the world, which would mean independence.
But do you think there's a case for having a referendum, say, before the next Scottish election?
I think that the timing is not something I would wish to be an expert on. It's really for the Scottish Parliament to decide, and they're the people that are elected to do it. So the timing, for me, is really for our political leaders to determine. What we've tried to do is say, for whenever we're asked to choose, we will be prepared for it. And we've got a prospectus which sets out in some detail exactly what we would be starting with and how we would work purposefully for a generation.
There's already some disappointment from more left-wing elements in the Yes movement. I mean, all those people marching through Glasgow the other week. What do we want? A sensibly balanced fiscal policy for 10 years with most of the risks on the downside. When do we want it now? It doesn't exactly get the heart going very fast, does it?
Well, I think as people reflect on what we're actually saying, they will see that it's a very ambitious prospectus for Scotland to create the sort of country we want, but it doesn't pretend that it arrives in our lap out of a tree overnight.
No,
it's purposeful action. And
the most serious point about what I've just said is that it's a political problem with Labour. Now, you stress repeatedly in your document that the risks in running a balanced fiscal policy are greater in a small country. Now, you're going to have Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party up here in Scotland saying, well, our programme is much more radical than Andrew Wilson's. And according to Andrew Wilson himself, there are fewer risks in implementing what we want to implement because we'll implement it right across the UK.
No, I don't agree with that. I think all of the risks for Scotland are in doing nothing, sticking with what we've got just now, because what we did yesterday, if it's done today, it will produce the same outcomes. But Corbyn's Labour Party will say, well, we'll not be sticking with nothing. Well, let's see if they ever have the opportunity to deploy whatever plan they've got. I've not really seen a coherent plan from that side of the debate thus far, and there certainly isn't one for Scotland where the financial controls are so limited. What we see and what we can learn from history is Britain is the most unequally performing economy by a mile in Europe and in the industrialised world. And there is nothing in any of the prospectuses I've seen to tackle that problem of regional inequality. The deficits of the United Kingdom are all made outside the southeast. The country is flying on one engine and it's completely unsustainable.
Currency. Critics say your idea of keeping the pound without being part of a formal currency union is a terrible idea. And in fact, your argument for independence rests, at least in part, in saying that Brexit will be a macroeconomic disaster for the UK. But one minute you say that, and the next minute you say we should keep the pound, where we will have to suffer the effects of that macroeconomic disaster, having absolutely no control over it.
Well, only one element of it, which is monetary policy. And of course, we have come to a balanced judgment.
Yes, but if Brexit is as bad as you say, you could very easily foresee a situation where the British government had to hike up interest rates because of a fall in the pound, because of lack of confidence. Scotland, your independent Scotland, would pay the price of that, but would have had no hand in the making of it.
Well, we've already seen a dramatic fall in the pound post-Brexit, and they didn't dramatically hike up interest rates. More likely for Britain, and all of the forecasts are for the slowest growth in Europe to be in the United Kingdom, and for, as a result, monetary policy to reflect that. However, what we've said, and I was trying to get the point out, because obviously it's a substantial area of thought, what we weigh up are the priorities for Scotland in the early days, and of course we argue that the priority is to get growth going in the economy, to put the public finances that we inherit from the UK on a sound footing, and to reach for long-term intergenerational improvement.
Well, I want to talk about that in a minute.
Monetary policy matters for that, but all of the evidence from other countries is you need to focus on these things.
Why not go for an independent currency?
Well, the beauty of doing this and retaining the stability of sterling as it stands for the time being, it's what worked for Ireland, albeit in a different century and at a different time. It's what they did. It's what the Governor of the Bank of England's predecessor advises is the sensible thing, and it allows us to focus on where the priorities should be. We've set out 6 tests that allow us to judge when it would be in our interest to do something differently and to set up our own currency. It would be when the economy was diverging, we were growing so well. It would be a reflection of our success. But in the meantime, people deserve clear answers to clear questions about what happens to my pension, my mortgage, and so on. And this allows them to have that certainty through a period of transition. You would have one when it was in your interest and not before. So why would you have one for the symbol of it rather than the practical substance of economic policy?
It's a very odd argument for independence to say we must have independence, but we don't want our own currency.
Well, it seems to work for independent France and independent Germany not to have their own currency, but to pool and cooperate with others. Monetary policy needs to be suitable for the situation you find yourself in, and we have to recognise the reality that we're very integrated, probably more integrated with the rest of the UK than any other countries that have become independent from one another since the war. So we recognise that reality. We recognise that we have to provide stability for jobs, for people's mortgages, and then focus our attention, not on the symbols, but on the substance of where we can make a difference. Long-term economic policy, attracting people to come and live in the country, and giving ourselves a chance over a generation to work for a better society. That's what I think an honest answer to that question is.
But balancing the budget, or at least getting the deficit down to 3%. I mean, look, let's accept all your figures that you think the deficit on independence would only be 6%. Again, you make the point that the risks of this in a small country are greater than they are in large countries. Practically anything that went wrong would throw... I mean, when I was reading that section of your report, it reminded me of George Osborne's Red Books, where there would be all these facts and figures and take the square root of this and look, the budget is in balance, and something always happened. You know, welfare bills were bigger than expected, or there was a Eurozone crisis.
Yeah.
Anything could throw your thing off course with a greater risk in a smaller country.
Well, in fact, we do the opposite of what the OBR and George Osborne has done, because we don't put assumptions for growth into the numbers. We could have just said, well, we've modelled it, we think growth's going to be faster, and look here,
you assume trend growth of
we assume that over time, the average performance of the past is the average performance of the future for inflation and growth, and we say, what would you do? Now, the point of this, Gordon, if I may say, is that without making wild predictions for growth, we show how over a period of 5 to 10 years, while growing the public finances, rejecting austerity, stewarding growth at the same time, we can bring discipline to the public finances sustainably. The alternative is to do what Britain continues to do, which is to spend all of the oil revenues on today's money, blow it all of that windfall is gone, to run up national debt, which is amongst the highest in Europe, which is putting a burden onto the next generation.
About the risk. Look, let me give you one
risk. But the point I'm making to you is that the risks are big countries get economic policy wrong such that their living standards are lower. Yes, small countries have to be cleverer, more adaptable, more agile, but all of the evidence of the countries we've looked at is the outcomes are better. Not only do they have higher living standards, but they have better and more coherent societies. They tackle inclusion and participation at the same time. The UK, waiting for a Labour government to make the UK better is for the birds. It's not going to happen. All the evidence of history is what we've got to
Let's just take the example of oil. I mean, you get round the problem of promising that oil money will pay for everything. You don't, and a lot of people have praised you for this. You simply say it should be used for a national investment bank, if there ever are any, oil revenues. But of course, the main effect on the Scottish economy of the collapse in oil prices was not on oil revenues. They go to the UK Treasury. It was in the real economy. The real economy of Scotland has been doing worse than the UK until very recently because of the hit on the Aberdeen and all these areas. Now, if something like that happened again in a small country which is dependent on oil, it would throw all your fiscal forecasts completely off course.
Again, you can see the response of all the small countries to the 2008 crisis. All of them responded better, more quickly, and have now got higher living standards than the UK.
Some of them went through traumatic experiences that Britain never went anywhere near.
Well, I think if you're living in Britain just now and you don't regard the economic outlook and the reality of the last 10 years as traumatic, then I don't think you're watching what's happening in the communities of the country.
There are lots of people in Ireland, for example,
but they're now back. They've responded.
But they're living in houses where they can never in their lifetimes imagine getting back the price they paid for it because of the nature of the housing bubble. You had problems of immigration in Ireland
there are problems,
and in Iceland.
Wherever you look, there are problems.
Yeah, but we had nothing like that here.
What I'm trying to say to you is wherever you look, there are always problems. The evidence of history, the evidence of modern history, is that small countries are better at policy making, more agile and able to respond as a result. The living standards of all these countries are higher than us. Their societies, the Irish model is different from the one that we would advise. Obviously, we recognise that we start from a different place. However, these countries perform better. And if we think, honestly, that the outcomes in Britain, the most unequally performing economy in the industrialised world, is as good as it gets, well, that's one argument, but it's not ambitious enough.
OK, all right. Just let's take head on your arguments about small countries. It seems to me the argument is largely circular. You pick 12 advanced economies, which happen to be doing quite well.
Yeah.
You do lots of analysis, and then, amazingly, you come to the conclusion they're doing better than Britain, which is hardly surprising, as that's why you picked those 12 in the first place. The argument is entirely circular.
No, and I think that's a fair point, but it's not what we're saying. It would be circular if that was the case. What we're saying is these are the 12 best performing countries we can find. Wouldn't it be good if we had ambitions to reach them? What are the lessons that we can learn from them? And one of the big lessons, Gordon,
I don't think anyone, including your critics, I mean, that's a fascinating part of your report. Any economic policymaker in Scotland, or indeed in Britain, could look at your report and say that. But my point remains. I mean, let me give you an example. You could say a better predictor of high GDP per capita is nothing to do with whether you're small or large, it's how far northwestern Europe you are. So yes, Scandinavia, and yes, Belgium and the Netherlands, but also Germany and France and Britain, and then small countries, not Portugal or Malta or Greece or the Baltic states, but not Spain or Italy either. And there's nothing in your report that convincingly demonstrates that the point I've just made is any worse than the points you made.
So I guess what I'm trying to say is, first point, intrinsically, none of these countries that are doing spectacularly well, and all of them have bits that you would choose not to do, but none of them that have done so well have got intrinsically anything that we don't have, with one exception, the Norwegian Oil Fund, which is now gone as an idea for us because the UK government...
But you're not addressing my point. There's nothing about them being small or large that's particularly important.
I was coming on to...
But you have to... I mean, look... As I say, there's a shopping list of good ideas. Your report is arguably brilliant, but it's supposed to be a rigorous and compelling argument for leaving the UK and becoming a small country, and it just isn't.
Just to get to the sentence on which I was about to rest the argument, which hopefully answers those points, Gordon, the lessons that we learn from are the key thing. What is it that they are doing? Not that there's some magic money tree or that there's something intrinsic that we've not got that we just have to invent. And what the lesson is, the core lesson, the number 1 and 2 points in the whole report are: 1, you need a strategy and a plan, and you need to stick to it for 25 years, a generation. 2, and this is the hard bit for Scotland, you need to try and agree about it across the political spectrum, because governments change. New Zealand's just moved from a Conservative to a Labour government, but the targets for its fiscal policy have stayed the same. The Nordic countries are another case in point, where across trade unions, business, across society, politicians agree on the big things that they have to do, and then they fight about how they do it. Now, I'll give you 2 great examples of why that's possible, even though the country of the argument here in Scotland, it seems impossible. Firstly, last week we said, not that we depend on it, but we think we can do better in growth. First 10 years, we think we can get to 2.5% a year. The Conservatives said this was ridiculous, and yet one day before, the leader of the Conservative Party had said we think we should reach for UK growth levels, which is just this.
All right.
The second point, which is really important, on migration, every single political party that counts in Scotland agrees the population problem of Scotland needs addressed, and we should be more friendly to migrants.
Incidentally,
Fantastic.
Denmark and Finland, 2 of the 3 countries you want us to emulate, are much more more hostile to immigration at the moment than Britain is.
Well, as I say, the price of beer in Norway is ridiculous. I wouldn't want that price of beer.
Yeah, but that's my point about cherry picking.
Well, we're not cherry picking. We're saying, what are the lessons from all these 12 countries that we can learn? What I'm saying is, more than any other country in Europe right now, we have an opportunity in Scotland to set a tone to the world that is friendly to migrants.
See, it's a
fabulous opportunity.
I still don't think you've answered my point about small and large countries. And look, even on the statistics you produce in your own report, you refer to various studies. Now, it's true there's a global sustainable competitiveness study, which UK is not in the top 10, and Finland and Denmark are. But on competitiveness, UK is number 7, Finland is number 10, New Zealand and Denmark are not in the top 10. And on attractiveness to the kind of venture capital you want to kickstart technology in the economy, Britain is number 2 in the world, and your 3 comparators don't even appear in the top 10. So why on earth would you want to leave one of the most competitive economies in the world in order to emulate countries which, by the figures you yourself produce, aren't doing as well as Britain?
Well, we make clear in the report that we want the ties that bind the United Kingdom in terms of our trading, our social relationships and all the rest of it to be underpinned, and that's why we've suggested an annual solidarity payment to show the rest of the UK.
No, but when it comes to, for example, venture capital, it's because of British government policies and the openness of the British economy. These are conscious decisions that have made Britain open. Why not just say, this is great, we want Scotland to take a full part of this as part of the United Kingdom?
Well, not everything in the world is broken and not everything needs to be changed, but a lot does. And the core point, I suppose, in response to you, Gordon, is these countries that you mention perform much better than the United Kingdom average. Scotland, as with all of the non-South East regions and nations of the UK, hugely underperforms the potential. This is not as good as it gets. You can cherry pick, as you've just done, 1 or 2 statistics to say the UK competes well. Great. We can do better, much better.
OK, we'll have to leave it there. What's next? Are you going to do a Scottish version of War and Peace?
I think I've just done it.
Andrew Wilson, thanks very much. Well, the Conservatives' Dean Lockhart, who sits on Holyrood's Economy Committee, was listening to that and joins me now. Are you convinced, Dean Lockhart?
No, Gordon, I'm not convinced at all. First of all, this report is all about independence. There just happens to be an SNP conference in 2 weeks' time, and this report is about reopening the debate on independence that was settled 4 years ago when Scotland voted clearly to reject the idea of independence. Now, the report that Andrew has produced raises many uncertainties and
independence is hardly an argument against them, is it?
Sorry, say that again?
I say, saying a nationalist party argues for independence is hardly an argument against them, isn't it? What do you expect?
But I think your point was right about the downsides highlighted in the report, about the massive austerity that would result from the budget deficit being cut, from the need to build up reserves for a new central bank, and the whole uncertainty over the currency question really call into question the downside risks of the report.
Well, yes, but on the other hand, I mean, look, this is a serious body of work. I think everyone accepts that. OK, some of the more over-enthusiastic independent supporters might not like it, but it outlines a perfectly sensible and realisable way of setting Scotland up as a small country. You'd have to accept that, wouldn't you?
I genuinely don't think it does. I think what it does is point to other small countries, as you say, in a cherry-picking the countries they want to identify as being aspirational. Now, it's not good enough to copy and paste some of what New Zealand did, some of what Singapore did. Those countries are all very, very different, and how they achieve their success is also very different as well. I happen to live in Singapore and Hong Kong for a number of years, and they're very different countries, but what they did do is focus on their core strengths, and that's what we should do here in Scotland, focus on our core strengths and build on them. We've got world-class universities, world-class cities, a world-class workforce, but we also haven't gotten to be part of a larger
Wilson would agree with all that. Hang on, let's bring in Jackie Bailey from Labour, who's magically appeared where Andrew Wilson was a minute ago. Are you convinced?
Look, we've been asking the SNP to talk about the economy seriously for the past 11 years that they've been in power. So
and they're doing
I welcome the fact that Andrew Wilson has produced this report. The tragedy for us is, you know, we've had to experience a decade of the economy stagnating, of poor productivity, of low growth, whilst the SNP have been in charge. So I welcome his contribution to the debate. It presents arguments for growing the economy, and any political party would aspire to do that, but it's not a blueprint for independence. And I'm very clear about that, because what we would face in order to get to, in 25 years, the batch of small countries he's picked, would be decades of austerity of the kind we've not seen.
He says not.
Well,
I mean, in his fiscal forecast, it assumes actual spending increases.
Sure, and he's made assumptions, and I understand why he's done that, because it presents the figures in a better light. No, I'm looking at what the Scottish Fiscal Commission tell us. This is the government's own fiscal commission that says that growth is unlikely to be more than 1%. We're trailing the UK, and the UK's growth isn't much better. But I do think you made a point that is a very valid one. You know, risk in small countries is much harder to manage. You would need substantial reserves, billions of pounds of reserves.
I'd love to take it the credit, but it's Andrew Wilson in his report who makes that point, not me.
You reference that. And it is the case that risk in bigger countries is much more manageable. The difference is Labour has a plan to grow the economy, to do so in a fair way so that everybody benefits. And in doing so, as part of the United Kingdom,
sorry, why doesn't Andrew Wilson have a plan to do? He's got a plan to grow the economy in a fair way. He's just sat there and outlined how he thinks that the regional inequality in the UK is a disgrace, and how his plans for independent Scotland.
And some of the countries that he's referencing, like Hong Kong, like Singapore, have some of the worst income inequality. So he doesn't make a big thing.
I mean, they're effectively city-states.
But his suggestions actually, you know, are contradictory. You can't have, on the one hand, low tax and low regulation that is epitomised by New Zealand's economy at the moment, and on the other hand, say, Finland is the answer, where you've got high taxes and better quality public services. They are contradictory.
Well no, they're not, because if you take... I mean, what I think Andrew Wilson is saying is you can take examples and lessons from these countries. He's not saying you slavishly copy any of these countries. What he's saying is that New Zealand has got some good things about the economy and employment there, that we can learn lessons about equality from some of the Scandinavian countries. He's not trying to equate them, so it's not contradictory.
Well, I believe it is, but what I'm keen to do is, of course, we should learn lessons from people abroad, but I think there is less risk and more opportunity remaining part of the United Kingdom with a Labour government who want to grow the economy for everybody's benefit, and who have proposals from 20 billion to the National Investment Bank in Scotland to 20 billion for a national transformation fund investing in infrastructure and jobs, all things that I think would create a transformational change in our economy.
Well, Dean Lockhart, I mean, if... And not just Andrew Wilson, but many people think there's a serious risk of Britain heading for a hard Brexit, and that could have a very bad effect on the British economy. Given that the Scottish Conservatives, particularly Ruth Davidson, are as opposed to that as Andrew Wilson is, can we look forward to the Scottish Conservatives, should that happen, adopting Andrew Wilson's proposals?
I don't think so, Gordon, not at all. I mean, the answer to Brexit, which accounts for the single market, which accounts for 16% of Scotland's trade, is not to leave the UK single market that accounts for 60%, over 60% of our trade. I'm confident we will get a deal with the European Union where we have substantial access to the single market, and then we can go on and make global trade agreements with large emerging countries like China, India and Japan. So I don't see that as being a particular risk, and I don't think...
Yes, but the obvious point to make there is you would accuse the SNP of being ideologically blinkered, because you would say that no matter what the evidence was, the conclusion would be independence. But you are effectively doing the same thing. You're saying it doesn't matter what kind of Brexit we have, the conclusion will be staying in Britain is the best possible thing in the best of all possible worlds.
That's an analysis based on a hard economic look at what the situation is. As I said, the European Union accounts for only 16% of Scotland's trade. The rest of the UK, the single market, is 60%. So just based on the economics alone, Gordon, it is essential that we maintain absolute freedom of access within the UK single market. And that is something the SNP has tried to put barriers in front of as a result of their resistance to the EU withdrawal bill.
Right, we'll have to leave it there. Look, Dean Lockhart, Jackie Baillie, thank you both very much.